Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Excellence in Collaborative Education event, Protest Medicine, How to Leverage Your Role as a Provider During Civil Unrest. We're thrilled to have a panel of students who have had experience providing care in emergency situations, including protests, with us today, and thankful for Casey Keys, who approached us first with the idea for this presentation. We'll be putting a lot of links in the chat for further resources, and links to further information. And you should know that you can download the chat at any time by clicking on the three dots in the lower right-hand corner, and you're welcome to do that as we fill it up with extra information for you. So Casey, over to you.
There we go. So thank you all for attending. My name is Casey Keys. I'm a second-year medical student at Unicom. Prior to UNE, I worked for 4 years as a paramedic in Minneapolis. When protests broke out this summer in response to the murder of George Floyd, I watched live streams of my former city and neighborhood burning. My old roommate sent me the photo you see on the right, and this was taken from the backyard of my old house. After a few days of this, I felt called to take some sort of action, so I chose to fly back to Minneapolis and use my experience in emergency medicine to support the protests. I used my contacts from my time in Minneapolis to connect with local aid groups and was involved in neighborhood watch and direct action, providing services during protests and at the memorial site established at 38th in Chicago, where George Floyd was killed. I've attended protests before this, but this is the first time I was serving the capacity as a street medic. I met a number of other street medics there and realized that there are many of my peers who would be able to utilize their knowledge and training to serve their communities, especially in times of protest. The information presented here comes from my paramedic experience at protests, specifically this summer, and research done on the topic. In the fall, I reached out to the amazing folks at CECE who gave me the green light for this presentation and connected me with my equally amazing panelists who will now introduce themselves. We will start with Wyatt.
Hi, my name is Wyatt Blackstone. I'm a junior in the Health, Wellness, Occupational Studies major here at UNE. I've been EMT for over 3 years now, and my EMS background involves 911 transfer work, along with a wildland fire EMT with deployments to Quebec, Canada. I'm also an EMT here on the Bedford campus throughout the semester.
My name's Bethany Gruskin, and I'm a second-year occupational therapy student. I'm currently completing my last clinical placement in Portland, Oregon. And I've been an EMT for a long time now and have a lot of experience working at a large university doing event medicine and stuff.
Hello, my name is John Caswell. I'm enrolled in the Accelerated Nursing Program, set to graduate this August here at UNE. I originally attended UNE for my undergrad degree in medical biology. I graduated in 2016 and from there focused on gaining patient experience. I became an EMT, then a paramedic down in the greater Boston area, which is where I've worked for the last 3 years.
Hi, I'm Chris Eidson. I'm a first-year DPT student at UNE. I did my undergrad at San Diego State, and I was in the military for 6 years, the 82nd Airborne, and during that time I also got my EMT certification and worked as an EMT in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
So, as a disclaimer, this presentation was compiled from primary scientific sources, previous protest medicine literature, and firsthand experiences. This presentation by no means will fully prepare or certify you to engage in any activity at a protest or not. Rather, engaging in a protest is an exercise of your personal volition, knowledge, training, and licensure. The aim of this presentation is to make you aware of physical, legal, and emotional risks of engaging in a protest. Our goal is to empower you to use your training to serve your community. We hope that this presentation encourages your continued research of and engagement with protest medicine. That being said, I do have two main rules. First, do no harm. Also, please don't break the law. And a quick note on politics. The aim and inspiration from this project came from the protests following the unjust murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis Police Department officers. This presentation and history of protest medicine itself is rooted in anti-racism. Foundational in this belief is exercise of resistance against established authority systems which support injustice and racism through violence and coercion. This is not intended to be a political discussion, but it's naive to discuss protest medicine outside of the context of the ongoing battle for civil rights in America. Which leads me to our next point. Police are 3 times more likely to use force on left-wing protests. This data has been gathered by over the last year by the US Crisis Monitor, a nonpartisan human rights group. Force in this case is use of tear gas, rubber bullets, batons, or other less than lethal measures by police. So for our learning objectives, I want you to become aware of historical and current role of street medics in protests, introduce concepts of legality for participation in protest, especially regarding the role of the street medic, be able to safely prepare for a protest, gain familiarity with injury patterns from common counter-protest weapons, and better understand the unique environmental factors present in protest. We are going to talk a little bit about history. So the Medical Committee for Human Rights was created to address the rampant healthcare inequality in southern states as the civil rights movement ramped up in the early 1960s. This program sent physicians, medical students, and college students to Mississippi as part of the famous Freedom Summer. However, their scope was severely limited by staunch segregationists in the Mississippi Board of Health. Volunteers were limited to only provide first aid, a stipulation they liberally explored. They opened free clinics and attended protests, and while doing so, noticed the physical and psychological benefits of having medical staff embedded in these movements. Although the nature of these medical volunteers is not what we see in modern protests, they were attending to the underserved Black population in the South and to fellow civil rights organizers. MCHR organizers opposed the Vietnam War, opened free clinics in inner cities, pushed medical schools to expand enrollment for Black applicants, and supported women's reproductive choice movements prior to Roe v. Wade. Street medic organizations and their development were also integrally influenced by activities of American Indian movement and the Black Panthers. More currently, the 1999 protests in Seattle against the WTO Ministerial Conference demonstrated a degree of organization among street medic groups that had not previously been seen. These protest medics came prepared to treat injuries from counter-protest weaponry used by the police. There have been numerous organizations that have risen through the early 2000s, and a list can be found via the link on this page, although many of them are now defunct. Standing Rock is also important because of the scale of that protest. Standing Rock demonstrated the transition from reactionary grassroots medicine to holistic services rendered through a long period of time. This happened again in cities like Minneapolis and Seattle this summer, where there were prolonged protests. So I want you to keep this mantra in the forefront of your head when preparing for attending a protest. Expect the best, but prepare for the worst. So we do have to touch on some legal and ethical concerns first and foremost. If you're serving as a protest medic, you are hoping to be protected under Good Samaritan laws. It is very important to be aware of the limitations of these laws and how to operate within them. Each state has slightly different wording, but the basic premise of Good Samaritan laws empowers bystanders to render aid in medical emergency without fear of reciprocity. Importantly, for Good Samaritan laws to be applicable, you have to be rendering all these services for free. If you expect any compensation, you're no longer protected. This covers first aid procedures rendered in good faith, so be attentive to your limits and your scope. I'm sure there are several EMTs in the audience, and all my panelists are certified as well, but simply having your EMT, paramedic, RN licensure in and of itself does not grant you autonomous scope of practice. At least regarding EMS, you must work under a physician's license. However, if you are rendering aid in good faith, you do not need physician authorization to perform in this capacity. Street medicine is not an arena in which to practice new skills or techniques. Operate within your scope, and when this comes down to is basically do no harm. Any aid or procedure you may be performing must be for the direct benefit of your patients. If you're trying something risky, you may be doing harm to them. When you declare yourself as a medical professional, most people will grant you a high degree of trust and esteem. Do not violate this. Consent. Even in chaotic and volatile environments, such as a protest, you still need to get consent. Ask before you touch anybody, ask before you render any aid, and if you're going to render aid, make sure to explain exactly what you're going to do. Recognize that your training comes from a Western tradition and that patients you may be caring for may not want this manner of aid, and that's a-okay. Respect their boundaries. Clear communication and respect are absolutely necessary for anything you may be doing on the street or really in your practice. Implied consent is a stickier situation, but necessary to cover. This applies when a party is rendered unconscious or otherwise incapacitated and there's an immediate threat to life or limb. The law provides protection when you would provide care that a reasonable person would request if they were not incapacitated. Don't take liberties with this, but if someone is injured to the point where you absolutely should step in, consider care escalation, most likely involving transport to a hospital. Self and security. Have a group available. If you can plug in with a local coalition or organization, then make sure to have their contact information. If not, bring a friend or a protest buddy. Stick with your protest buddy or buddies and make sure to plan for rendezvous points if separated. If you travel together, try and avoid future problems if one or both of you are arrested. For example, have spare keys, don't lock your bikes together. Ideally, have contacts of friends who are not protesting. These folks can help pick you up if things become volatile or if you're arrested. Have multiple plans and don't let them rely on a single factor to fail. Communication is very difficult in protests. Having your phone gives you access to the internet, news, text, etc. However, when large groups of people gather, the cell service is usually very poor. Also, if you are arrested, your phone will likely be confiscated and not returned until much later, if at all. Be prepared for this. If you can avoid taking your phone, avoid it. If you have to take your phone, be cautious. That being said, protest etiquette is very important. Do not take photos of protesters' faces. These have been used later in arrests and persecution of individuals attending these events. If you take a photo, it carries metadata that can be harvested to place individuals at specific locations and times. Also, for the love of all things decent, do not be an influencer at these protests. Write phone numbers for legal services, cabs, or other forms of transport, and friends who may be off-site. Write them on your arm or in your legs in permanent marker and make sure to refresh these numbers as you may sweat them off. So now I'm going to tap on one of my panelists, Bethany. Bethany, can you speak to how you see your role as an occupational therapist in preparation for safety of protests?
Absolutely. And I think that's definitely a question that we've talked a lot about as a group, is how as an occupational therapist do I fit into this scope? And I think the there's a few things that really stuck out to me. The first is how to help people prepare safely for the role of protester and for the occupation of protesting. And that means planning ahead, making sure that you bring extra medication if you are a person who depends on medication, or wearing your medical ID bracelet so that you can be identified as somebody who needs extra assistance. And then also preparing for the sensory experiences you may have. By nature of protests, they're very loud, but they're also and crowded, but there can also be tear gas and things like that we'll speak on a little bit later, that may be new sensory experiences, and desensitizing yourself to those ahead of time may help reduce some of your anxiety and help you fully participate. And then the second piece of this is occupational therapy has its roots in mental health. And so how do we help support people from a mental health perspective when engaging in this occupation? So that means not putting protesting ahead of your own mental health needs.
All right, let's talk a little bit about PPE. So the Hong Kong protests of 2019 highlighted the equipment necessary when confronted with heavy police presence. Much of this equipment you probably won't need, but you also are much better being prepared. Expect the best, but prepare for the worst. You want to stay operational as long as possible and not find yourself in need of another medic. I feel like much of this is self-explanatory, but I did want to emphasize a few points. Bring a helmet. Even if you aren't wearing it initially, have it on your backpack. This can be a bike helmet, construction helmet, hard hat from the tool store. Honestly, doesn't matter. Things will get thrown and shot, and your head is delicate. Eye protection for the same reason. Ideally, bring something similar to what you use in undergrad chemistry lab, something that will block direct chemical and physical agents, and will hopefully seal in and prevent penetrance of anything aerosolized. Wear a mask. This will protect your identity. It keeps chemical agents off your face, and especially relevant this last year, given the global pandemic ravaging our country, prevents the spread of COVID. And I did want to take a moment to point out that there was no spike in COVID cases in Minneapolis due to strict adherence to these laws. When social distancing was possible, it was enforced, and everyone was wearing masks. Go back a little bit about there. So protests involve a lot of walking, and maybe even if you're unlucky, some running. So plan accordingly. I dealt with a lot of blisters when I was in Minneapolis at protests this summer. Wear nondescript clothing that you're okay getting covered in dirt, pepper spray, blood, etc. No logos that can easily identify you, and cover your tattoos for the same reason. Leather gloves, nothing synthetic or polyester that will melt, are helpful for dealing with the CS canisters or anything else hot or on fire. Additionally, have a pack of clean exam gloves on your person if you have to deal with any sort of emergency dealing with bodily fluids. Consider how to mark yourself as a medic. Standard is a red cross, put it on your backpack, put it on your helmet, put it on your shirt. And Bethany, in regards to preparation, can you speak a little bit more about how as an EMT you've prepared or improvised medical supplies in difficult situations?
Absolutely. As an EMT, we get training on how to use whatever resources are at our fingertips to make whatever we might need. So I once fashioned a wrist splint from a baseball cap and some hair ties. And that's also very similar to what we do in occupational therapy, is using what you have to engage in therapy. And so think about what you have on your person and what those around you may have. So you're going to prepare for the best, expect the worst, like Casey said. But in the event that, for example, you run out of bandages, there's a lot of common items such as t-shirts, feminine hygiene products, toilet paper that other people may be carrying on them that you can use to your advantage. So don't be afraid to think creatively about the materials available to you.
So we're going to talk a little bit about situational awareness as well. So the figure you see on the screen is the OODA loop. It's a cute name for a common method of thinking about and responding to situations, especially rapidly changing or hostile situations. It was originally developed by the military, and many police forces use it or something similar. It stands for observe, orient, decide, act. Keep this as a mantra in the back of your head. It may allow you to pause and deliberately respond to a changing situation instead of just reacting. With a framework of constant observation and reorientation, try not to become another casualty. Protests can evolve rapidly and escalate. You don't want to be caught unprepared or unaware when this does happen. Be very aware that everyone brings their own unique personal politics and ideologies to this protest. How some individuals choose to protest may include more violent methods. This may escalate the protest, and police aren't going to differentiate who is violent in the protest and who is not. For any larger event, assume that there will be undercover police present. There have been many instances as well where violent right-wing agents have embedded themselves undercover in protests with the aim of inciting violence. Prime example in Minneapolis this summer was a member of the noted right-wing organization, the Aryan Cowboys, began breaking windows of local businesses, which sparked riots and looting in the area. Do what you can to familiarize yourself with your environment. You will most likely not have any advance warning of where the protest is going for security's sake. Information like this is often kept private among organizers. But if you're embedded with other medical staff, try and get this information and use it to plan an exit if things escalate and become dangerous. Preparing your physical equipment and mental faculties before a protest is worth the time. Wyatt, I'm going to tap on you next. You have experience as a wildland firefighter, and I want you to speak specifically about a fire you're working up in Quebec. I think it was Quebec Fire 332, and how this fire forced you to reassess your routes of egress and situational awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Casey. So in 2018, I was deployed with the main fire crew as a wildland firefighter and EMT up in the Quebec province of Canada. This fire had a very interesting dynamic as it was kind of in the middle of nowhere. And our main goal of this fire was to prevent it from moving towards towns and cities miles away, as well as to protect the timber. So because of its remote location, we were based probably 20 to 30 miles away and had to fly in every morning by helicopter to get to the fire line. So once the fire got underway, I was teamed up with 3 others from the fire crew in charge of cutting pathways up along the fire and putting out any spot fires that the fire might have thrown along its way, as well as to do some initial attack at the head of the fire. Our main goal was to create well-marked, well-communicated points of access and evacuation routes throughout the forest because it was very hilly and very thick brush and hard to move in. And this required constant situational awareness because 5 times throughout the 2 weeks we were there, we had to get emergency evacuated due to explosive fire conditions and weather patterns called RH mismatch. One of the days we were there on the fire line, we radioed that 2 Canadian firefighters got injured because they were cutting down a burning tree that fell on them. So we were tasked to head over towards them and assess their injuries and package them and transport them. While we were on our way over to these 2 Canadian firefighters, everyone was radioed that we were about to have an RH mismatch and would need to be evacuated immediately. Thankfully, due to a lot of preparation, pre-planned evacuation routes we made, which multiple of them were getting currently burned over by the fire, we were able to evacuate along with all the other firefighters. This fire really sunk in the importance of constant situational awareness and communication. All my training via EMT and wildland firefighter training had provided. We had multiple points of egress destroyed during the fire, as well as by the water bombers flying overhead to suppress the fire, dropping water on our path. We had to be constantly assessing everything going on around us, actively making sure that we are making the most informed decisions and actions based off the situation we are currently in. And this can be applied anywhere, whether it be a fire, medical scene, or a protest. Situations can change fast and rapidly, and it requires a lot of pre-planned communication and constancy and assessment to making sure that you're keeping yourself as well as your patient ultimately safe. So this is an ongoing process that needs to happen in your mind.
Thank you, Wyatt. I'm also going to ask Chris, because you're the only member of our group that actually has been trained in the military. And I want to see if you can speak a little bit more about your experience with this mindset or specific experiences where it's been important.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Wyatt was talking about, like when we say egress and ingress, like we're talking about how you get where you're going and how you're planning on getting out. And where these can be mobile protests, and we've seen that they can go entirely across cities, and downtown areas where there's might not be a lot of access, always keeping in mind where you are and how to get in and out of there is going to be the number one thing to make access for emergency, medical, ambulance, anything like that, to get in and out of there, as well as getting yourself out of there. So being able to give directions and being able to get yourself out and somewhere safe, and those around you. And those are just something that you just can't forget or ignore, thinking you know an area or thinking you're going to be in a certain spot. Remember, these can be mobile events and you need to be prepared.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the environment as well. So be aware of the environment and the weather on the day of the protest and prepare accordingly. There are a variety of groups handing out water at many of the protests, but don't count on them. Water is heavy, but you also need it for hydration, clearing chemical irritants, etc. Mayo Clinic states that people need between 2.7 and 3.7 liters a day in normal conditions, but if it's very hot, then that number is going to rise. Bring enough water for you and your protest friends. Protests in the cold also happen, and this is particularly relevant in case of trauma and bleeding, as hypothermia affects perfusion and clotting factors. So if someone is injured and starts losing body heat, their chances of morbidity and mortality rise dramatically. Mylar space blankets such as this one are super light and pack up very small. I keep several in my first aid kit. Also, just because it's cold doesn't mean you won't get sunburned and dehydrated. There are also a myriad of potential hazards that could arise at any protest. especially if the protest escalates into violence. This is going back to the previous slides on situational awareness. Be cognizant and aware of your environment and react accordingly. Don't become a casualty. Wyatt's firefighter experience once again gives us an important insight into caring for patients in an austere environment. Wyatt, can you speak a little bit about environmental concerns specifically with hyper and hypothermia?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the main injury patterns we saw in any fire that we worked was environmental injuries. And a lot of these injuries were relatively minor, just some minor dehydration, heat fatigue, but it doesn't take much to elevate heat fatigue to heat stroke. And one thing you have to consider while working in these strenuous environments, whether that be the wilderness carrying a backpack or out on the hot pavement during a protest, is how you're going to treat your patient with hyper or hypothermic injuries. Odds are you're not going to have a nice cool room to sit someone down and let their body temperature drop. So you have to consider other ways to lower someone's body temperature. This might even be as simple as popping open a few cold ice packs and placing it on their arteries and groin and putting them in the shade to cool down. But part of the situational awareness we were talking about earlier is constantly being aware of where you are and being like, am I in the environment where I'm able to treat a patient? And if the environment I am in doesn't allow me to treat the patient, where can I move my patient to treat them? Another thing you have to remember is for hyperthermic emergencies or your body getting too hot, is water is a very important resource to help combat this. And water is a very heavy, limited resource. You have to make sure that you have enough water for yourself as well as any patient who might need it. And like we said earlier, if you're at a protest, it's not guaranteed that anyone's going to be handing out bottled water to protesters. So it's something you have to factor in when you're packing for your protests. You also have to be careful you're watching your electrolytes. So if you're drinking copious amounts of water and sweating all day long, your body can really get depleted of electrolytes and all the salts and sugars in your blood that you need to function. So I suggest having some sports drinks or even Gatorade powder handy that you can dissolve in your water bottle and drink if need be. And if you don't want to go out and buy a sports drink, you can make your own at home just with a few tablespoons of table salt and honey dissolved in water. You also have to keep in mind with what comes with heat fatigue and heat exhaustion comes grumpiness. Out on the fire line, we would see this all the time because you would be hiking many miles a day, carrying heavy backpacks, not drinking as much water as you should, and you would just get very grumpy. And this is important to take note because at a protest, if you do have to move or transport a patient, it might take longer than you expected just because of heat. Heat fatigue might be affecting that patient, and you might just be grumpy and have a more unpleasant time than you originally thought you would. But you also have to make sure you're keeping in mind what time of the year it is. So if you're out protesting Portland right now at the middle of February, odds are you're not going to see many hyperthermic emergencies. You'll probably be seeing hypothermic emergencies. So your body getting too cold. So again, you have to constantly be thinking, how am I going to treat someone with hypothermia? And it's also important to know the signs and symptoms of hypothermia. And one odd symptom of hypothermia that sometimes people can miss with moderate to severe hypothermia is paradoxical heating. And this occurs when people's precapillary sphincters release the warm core blood into their systemic circulation. Their body tricks them into thinking that they're hot, not cold. And with this, you can see people like rapidly taking off layers of clothing, unzipping their jackets, as well as more mental cognitive functional declines. And it can be kind of an unusual presentation, odd to see, but it's a presentation nonetheless that you have to keep in mind. And my last environmental concern, which Casey already touched a little bit on, but is making sure that you're wearing the proper footwear, because especially at a protest, the grounds can have a lot of broken glass, dirt, chemicals that will destroy your shoe and even infiltrate your patient's feet if they're not wearing proper footwear. So make sure you have plenty of baby powder, gauze, tape in your bag to fix up any foot injuries, because not only foot injuries are painful and annoying, but they can also limit your mobility, which is the last thing you'll want.
Thank you, Wyatt. All these previous considerations are to try to make sure that you don't get in the way. If you're at a protest, you're not doing it for clout or recognition. Hopefully, you're attempting to support the cause and serve your community. And you can't do that if you're in the way. Be useful, not important. So now we're going to get into some common counter-protest weapons. We're going to start with riot control agents, colloquially known as RCAs. I'm sure a lot of you have seen footage or videos from this summer of the tear gas being deployed. So an RCA is basically any chemical irritant used to incapacitate or disperse crowds. These substances are aerosolized either via solvents or from ignition to maximize distribution. Two most common forms of chemical weapon are capsaicin and oleoresin, which is derived from the spicy chemical in peppers. It's also known as pepper spray or mace, and CS gas, which is 2-chlorobenzyl-melanonitrile. Both chemical irritants that cause extreme pain and secretion of mucous membranes, pain and burning on skin areas affected, coughing, upper respiratory inflammation, nausea, vomiting, and temporary blindness. So to treat these, first and foremost is decon. Available, given your situation, try and remove all extraneous clothing, equipment that has the chemical on it. Think about contact lenses too. Chemical irritants stuck behind contact lenses cause a lot of pain and may even permanently damage the eye. Remember, these agents do cause a lot of pain, which is going to provoke panic and anxiety, especially for individuals receiving their first dose. For the most part, short-term exposure to these agents does not carry any long-term consequence, and the pain and loss of sight is only temporary. That being said, losing your sight mid-protest is very dangerous, so you want to restore that as fast as possible. Most chemicals delivered via spray have their active agent suspended in an oil, which after being sprayed will dry and crystallize. These crystals will slowly dissolve with natural sweat, tears, body oil, and reactivate the chemical, leading to continuous pain. So one school of thought regarding treatment is dry treatment. Any liquid you apply will reactivate and spread the chemical irritant. So use dry and clean cloth to dab the chemical off. Do not wipe or rub it in. Pepper spray has a distinct orange color, so if you're using a light cloth, you'll see what color you can remove. Any sources of moving air, such as vents in a car or fans, facilitate the off-gassing of the dried compound and also provide symptomatic relief. The more you dry the chemical out, the easier it is to remove and the less it hurts. The next method is flushing. As stated above, any sort of liquid will reactivate and disseminate the RCA. So if you're going to flush it, you need a lot of water. If flushing, you apply continuous water for as long as you can, usually about 10 to 15 minutes, until you can be sure to have removed all the chemical, and then dab the rest of the chemical off in between flushes to physically remove it. Chris, you're the only member in our panel who's been fully exposed to RCAs during your military training. Can you speak a little bit about what this feels like firsthand and how you were trained to deal with that?
Yeah, Casey. So one of the biggest things that you face with these type of RCAs is the panic that comes along with it. And that's intended. That's one of the things that they plan on when this is used against protesters, is that it's disorienting and it induces pain. People are going to want to leave the area. But what ends up happening is people can have panic attacks along with this if they have compromised breathings, like COPD, asthma, anything like that. This can also be something you have to watch out for as a medical provider, is the secondary effects. And how you can help to mitigate that is yourself staying calm. If you're around someone that's been exposed to this, chances are, even if you yourself weren't directly exposed, you will get some of that off-gassing, some of that contact with the RCA itself, and you need to be prepared yourself to stay calm and keep your patient calm. Along with that, one thing, and in this picture, you see that the individual with the milk in the eyes is not wearing gloves. You want to wear gloves and change them frequently, because as soon as you help somebody decontaminate from an RCA and you either touch yourself or the next person, that RCA is going to stick with you until you've properly decontaminated yourself and all of your clothes. So just keep in mind that it can be hours after the event and you could still have some of that on yourself or touch someone that had it on them, and you're reactivating, re-exposing yourself or a future patient. So that's something you just have to keep in mind. And again, staying calm and keeping your patients calm is going to be the best way to facilitate giving that medical aid.
Thank you. So something that I think a lot of people get passed around information-wise is called LAW. It stands for liquid, antacid, and water. And other people use milk, as you can see in this picture. However, there is no evidence to support this. And in my opinion, adding extra chemicals to your already inflamed eyes is a bad idea. Anecdotal reports from my time this summer from people who were tear gassed, they do state that milk provides a temporary relief. However, in regard to home mixtures of sodium bicarb, which is a common antacid, you may not properly dissolve the crystals, which can cause abrasions to the eyes. I've also got studies that look at the various agents to shorten durations of symptoms from RCAs, and that didn't find any difference between using Malox, which is a brand of liquid antacid, 2% lidocaine gel, which is a topical anesthetic, baby shampoo, milk, or water. There is no magic solution, even in the hospitals, that's going to get rid of this stuff. So the best cure is going to be fresh air, time, and reassurance. Speaking of fresh air, one of the things you can do to help create your own fresh air is get rid of the canisters that are usually liberally dispersed. Keep in mind that they ignite and burn to aerosolize their contents. Use your leather gloves to throw them or cover them with a traffic cone or bucket. By covering them, you also deprive them of oxygen and they burn out. So if you see protesters carrying traffic cones, that's why. I'm going to turn to John next. John was a paramedic in Boston, and he's treated many people who've been exposed to various chemical irritants. John, can you talk us through how you would decon somebody who was exposed?
Yes, of course. Yeah. So pepper spray is the most common RCA that I've come in contact with. And with that, you always want to wash out the eyes in affected areas, ideally in a well-ventilated area. The first time I treated someone who had been pepper sprayed, it was freezing cold out in January. I was still a new paramedic at the time. So immediately I moved them into the back of the ambulance. And by the time we got to the ER, I was practically a patient myself because it is definitely a potent chemical in a confined space. So oftentimes patients can become frantic and start to reach out. They have almost always been rubbing either their eyes or face. So you want to make sure they aren't grabbing onto you and getting it into your clothes and skin as well. Again, you want to make sure you're not becoming a patient yourself and making sure you're mindful of where the water is running off to. You're going to be washing out their eyes most likely, and you want to make sure that's not going into their eyes, from their eyes into their mouth or nose, creating an airway problem. As Chris was saying, a big part of this treatment is just making sure that the patients are calm themselves.
Thank you, John. So we're going to move on to our next common class of counter-protest weapons. These are kinetic impact projectiles. They're also known as less than lethal rounds, and they can take many different forms, but all of them are basically just pain compliance. The 40 millimeter less than lethal round is also known as the rubber bullet, as seen at the bottom left, and is designed to be shot off the ground at an angle where it hits the lower extremities of protesters. However, many protests have demonstrated they're often being shot straight into crowds. And a study from the British Journal of Medicine states that rubber bullets carry about a 3% mortality rate, and about 15% of victims are left with some sort of permanent injury. Most of these serious injuries occur when the projectile strikes the head or neck, which is why we wear helmets. However, they're also extremely damaging to extremities, soft tissues, and can easily break bones. They've been implicated in many delayed incidences of internal bleeding as well. Impacts near airways will cause edema and swelling, which may later occlude the airway, and any injuries to the head or neck carry a much greater likelihood of death and disability. You can see the welts from pepper balls on the top right and a beanbag guns on the bottom right. Bottom line is treat injuries from any of these weapons or rounds as a high velocity blunt force trauma. Be cognizant of the soft tissue damage they cause and potential later complication, and encourage victims to follow up at hospitals to rule out internal damage. I'm going to turn again to Chris to speak about his experience with kinetic impact projectiles and what kind of injuries you expect with these weapons.
Yeah, so with kinetic impact projectiles, it's just like you said, you're going to be seeing a lot of blunt force trauma, bruising, like hematomas, lacerations, and fractures. And predominantly, and we would hope to see in just the lower extremities, as you said, they're intended to be fired at the ground and ricochet up into the legs. However, the angle of that shot, even if the individual firing the rounds are aiming for that ricochet effect into the lower extremities, you have to take into account the angle. There was an incident in La Mesa, California last year where police were firing from the top of their precinct. And even though they were aiming for that ricochet effect, an innocent bystander that was just crossing the street at a trolley stop ended up getting hit in the head and was in a coma for weeks. And that was due to the angle that the officers were firing from resulted in an increased angle coming out of the ricochet. So they're always a danger, and the eyes especially are a concern due to easy trauma affecting vision and permanent vision loss. And the American Academy of Ophthalmology has come out in recent years denouncing the use of rubber bullets and beanbag rounds for this very reason. And then we're also, if anybody does get hit in the abdomen and the throat, even if they seem like they're fine, realize that once that adrenaline goes away, they might end up expressing symptoms of internal bleeding, damage to internal organs and whatnot. So constantly check on anybody that did take any of those rounds to soft tissue and make sure that they're okay, even if it has been a little bit of time since the initial round struck them.
So now we're going to talk about something a little different. So outside agitation. In addition to preparing for standard counter-protest weapons, you should be prepared for other groups. The police haven't been using live munitions against protesters. However, there may be multiple factions or ideologies at a given protest. Not everyone is there for the same reason. I'm sure that during the summer, you all at least heard mention of the Boogaloo Boys, a vociferously anti-government militant group, members of which are pictured here. I actually saw the blonde guy at a few of the protests in Minneapolis this summer, and each time he was heavily armed. Many of the Boogaloo Boys state they're sympathetic to anti-police brutality protests, but they also show up to these protests heavily armed. Due to their militant ideologies, the presence and armaments that they bring with them poses a greater risk for escalation of violence. An example of this of outside agitation is after Minneapolis police killed Jamar Clark in 2015, there were prolonged protests outside of the Minneapolis 4th Precinct. During these protests, a group of 4 armed men were seen multiple times and heckled the crowd with racist epitaphs before ultimately shooting long guns into the crowd. No one was killed, but 5 people were injured. This summer as well, during the George Floyd protests in Minneapolis, stashes of incendiary devices were found in many South Minneapolis neighborhoods. Thankfully, due to the neighborhood communication and dispersion of this information, many of these weapon caches were located and disposed of. John, someone who's dealt with traumatic injury patterns firsthand, I want to have you speak on your experience with treating and assessing gunshot wounds.
Yeah, so working in Revere, I got to experience a number of gunshot wounds, most of which were actually very straightforward. Trauma is all about speed because time is always essential to increasing patient survival, and really nothing you're going to be able to do in the field is going to fix a GSW. One run that stands out, though, was a male in his 30s who was shot twice in his legs and once in his abdomen. Luckily, the patient was conscious the whole time and able to provide pressure on his abdomen himself effectively until we got there. His legs really were almost a non-factor, which is something that can be tough to move on from and not get fixated on just one injury that you know is there, but to able to move on and identify what can kill the patient in the immediate future. In this case, his legs had a clear through and through in his left and a grazing shot on his right with no deep tissue involvement, both of which had minimal bleeding. By the time we arrived, so a quick bandage on each was sufficient. We then moved on to really applying focused pressure on his abdomen where we know that there's some internal damage. And right before we started moving to Mass General, we wanted to make sure we hadn't missed any additional trauma. While trauma is definitely not the time to do a detailed past medical history and really in-depth assessment, you still need to cover the essentials like lung sounds and an accurate head to toe so you don't miss a less obvious injury that could still be life-threatening. This patient, I believe from our arrival on scene to handoff in the ER, was with us less than 30 minutes, which is great considering rush hour and traffic. We had about a 15-minute or so drive, and I believe he did quite well from what I was told after.
Thank you, John. We're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about one of the newer weapons that's being used against protests, the long-range acoustic device, or LRAD. It's very loud, very high-frequency sound that's used to disperse and disturb crowds. The LRAD itself is that little black box you see mounted on top of the armored vehicle. They also have units that are handheld. Although not commonly used, they have been showing up at protests in Pittsburgh, Orlando, and Ferguson. There honestly isn't a whole lot of data about long-term effects on human body from the LRAD, but commonly reported side effects include pain, migraine, nausea, and hearing loss. The LRADs emit a sound that is as loud as 151 decibels in a 1,000-meter range, and the human threshold for acoustic pain is about 130 decibels. Earplugs and headphones can block about 15 to 45 decibels depending on their quality. And just for some more data, NIOSH and OSHA, two of the safety organizations, suggest that individuals hearing noises at 100 and 115 decibels respectively not exceed 15 minutes of exposure daily. So Chris, I know you've done some research on LRADs. So what can you tell us about how they've been used at protests?
Yeah, so like you said, they haven't been used frequently in the US, but they are popping up at some major protests that we've seen in recent years. And one thing to keep in mind is they operate as both a public address system, so like a PA system, and as a sonic weapon. So the police and law enforcement might be using it to address the crowd one moment, and suddenly they're pointing it at you and using it to cause that nausea, that pain, and try and direct you and clear you out of whatever area you're in. It is a directional weapon, so it only will affect it within the direction that it's facing. However, it's indiscriminate, so anybody that's there will be affected by the LRAD. They use it to cordon off areas, so keep people from crossing lines, as well as to push crowds back and funnel you into areas where you can be arrested or easily detained. It causes severe headaches, migraines, and discomfort. There isn't evidence of long-lasting effects. However, there are some cases in the Supreme Court right now of people suing law enforcement for using this for long-term effects that they are experiencing. It also, that's one of the reasons that police have been hesitant to use it, is because there's potential First Amendment violation issues with using the LRAD. So law enforcement has been hesitant to use it, but we have seen it turn up in recent protests.
So we're going to talk now. So you have an injured patient, and now we need to figure out how to get them out of there. So for anyone who's taken an EMT class, what's the first thing you see on every skills exam? BSI, scene safe, right? But at a protest, especially with high acuity injuries, it is decidedly not a safe place. Large-scale street closures in anticipation of the protest and the size of the crowd make the logistics of getting an ambulance into a crowd very complicated. Ambulances also would typically respond to calls at a protest with a police escort, if they respond at all. So keep in mind that protesters may not want to interact with the police or EMS for fear of reciprocity. Police have been known to comb over ERs after events to identify and charge individuals with protest-related injuries. So seeking treatment in a hospital may not be appealing for certain individuals. It is not your role to judge anyone for this, but to work with them to get the care that they need. All that being said, if you are in doubt or someone has experienced a medical emergency, you need to call 911 or get them to a hospital. Just because someone is in urgent need of medical attention, that doesn't make all the aforementioned factors disappear. And so an example of this is in 2004, Victoria Snellgrove was shot with a less than lethal round during a riot at a Red Sox win in Boston, less than half a mile from a major trauma center. Ambulances were delayed in getting her due to the crowds, and Snellgrove died as a result of her injuries. So if a patient who is in severe medical need, you don't want to be waiting on scene. Rather than waiting and hoping that the ambulance is going to get there, you need to work on egress. Stabilize your patient as best you can and move them away from the protest. Try and make your way back towards the hospital, and if you can, get to areas that are not going to be congested by the protest. Stay in communication with 911 dispatchers, and if possible, work with them to coordinate handoff. Otherwise, you may have to deliver the patient to the hospital yourself. At all times, respect patient consents. This is very important and goes back to our early discussion. If a person is altered as a result of their medical emergency, then you work under implied consent. John, from your time as a paramedic, I want to have you talk a little bit about moving in and out of large-scale events and how you navigated this. I think specifically you had a long-term casino extrication that you were involved in.
Yeah, so entering egress can be a very challenging problem to work around in EMS. We had a call at the Encore Casino in Everett while it's still being built. A forklift had collapsed on someone and basically created a cage around him. Just getting the correct floor location over the radios was a nightmare, let alone finding which entrance we needed to use or how to even get up to him. Eventually, we were able to find him, and while the firefighters were working on cutting him out, we were giving pain medication, trying to assess how bad his injuries were, and stabilize him for the transport out. Like I said before, with speed and traumatic injuries is always important, but the entering egress scenarios like this, or like in a protest, complicates things greatly. Compares the gunshot wound victim I talked about earlier, where we were able to pinpoint his location, right down to the street number, get in and out. This call at the Encore from start to finish almost took us 2 hours, and we were even closer to the hospital than in Revere. The point is, when it's just not a standard call with a known address and exact location, it most likely will take us a long time to get in and extricate the patient. If you are on the street, and you should expect this and plan for a longer response time, and if possible, try and identify more than just a street address. Use identifiable landmarks is usually a huge help.
Wyatt, you too, I know we spoke a little bit about the Quebec Fire 332, and you had to get those Canadian firefighters out there, but do you have any other instances where you've had to respond to large or rapidly changing situations?
Yeah, absolutely. So most of the MCI or mass casualty incidents I have dealt with have usually revolved around motor vehicle crashes. And some of the most interesting motor vehicle crashes I've dealt with have been snowmobile crashes in the winter. So these are people driving snowmobiles that can reach up to 90, 120 miles an hour, depending on the snowmobile. And so it has all the trauma patterns of a motorcycle crash and a car crash, but they're in the middle of nowhere in the winter and on a low visibility snowmobile trail. And you have to constantly be worried about other snowmobilers coming around the corner of the path, going 90 miles an hour at you or your patient. So like with any mass casualty incidents, it's important to have great communication as well as well-defined roles of your team members. So whether that be one team member treats the less injured or the more injured patients while you treat the others, it all depends on how big the incident is and what the incident is. And situations can change extremely fast and rapidly, and it's also good to have team members looking out for that and communicating and strategizing what to do when the situation does change. So I was to say, if you look at this during your protest, make sure you have very well communicated and planned routes of escape, knowing that your forms of communications might not work. So if cell phone is your main form of communication, like we said earlier, hundreds of thousands of people at the protest using their phone, you're probably not going to have great cell phone service, or the police might shut down cell phone towers in order to better perform their job. So you just have to keep that in mind and make sure you plan ahead and plan accordingly.
So this is something that I hadn't thought about until this summer as well, but there are a lot of kind of expanded concerns and things that will be needing your attention outside of the glaring injuries from tear gas or from rubber bullets. So I hadn't considered the long-term effects of what a protest does to a community. So in South Minneapolis this summer, due to the violence and looting, almost the entirety of the south part of the city was closed down for quite a period of time. This meant that the ability to acquire basic supplies like food and water were severely curtailed. Minneapolis, however, came together, and there were numerous drop sites where people could get food, diapers, etc. But this is the exception, not the rule of what we've seen happen. One of the things to think about, though, is with these businesses being shut down, that means liquor stores are also shut down, and individuals may not be able to obtain alcohol. And of all the substance withdrawals, alcohol withdrawal is potentially fatal and carries heavy comorbidities. It sounds strange, but to get individuals with alcohol use disorder access to alcohol during shutdowns may literally save their lives. It's beyond the scope of this presentation, but the CWA scale is the common clinical scale to assess alcohol withdrawal, and there's a link to the MD Calc CWA calculator on the slide. Other examples are members of the community with opiate use disorder are still going to run into barriers, but they're going to continue to use. Furthermore, if there are methadone clinics in the areas, these may be shut down as well, and people may resort to street obtained opiates rather than risking withdrawal. And this may increase the rates of accidental overdoses. So for that reason, it behooves you to have Narcan in your kit. Narcan is available over the counter at any pharmacy without a prescription. So if you're engaged in any sort of prolonged protest, then it's also good to identify, if you can identify these people, if you can try to engage in harm reduction, have Narcan on you is one of those strange things that you want to keep in your first aid kit, but do it because you might save a life. And consider too, the people with chronic health conditions that may be adversely affected by these shutdowns as well. Consider group homes, assisted living facilities. Once again, operate within your scope when trying to lend help, but if necessary, assist or advocate for these individuals to be relocated away from these areas. Which brings us to our next point. If you want to engage in protest, if this is something that you're interested in doing, then some of the first steps can be trying to be more useful. We're in the works with trying to plan a stop the bleed training, Narcan training. I would strongly suggest attending a protest beforehand, just to see what the environment's like, along with what Bethany was saying. Try to find a way to kind of desensitize yourself to these stimuli. So when you're trying to step into the role of a caregiver or provider, you're not turning into a patient yourself. And once again, I know all of our panelists have their EMT, but if you, and all of us, a lot of the people in this presentation, I assume are part of the allied health professions, but there is a specific set of training that kind of comes with that first response, EMR, EMT classes. So those are things to pay attention to and hopefully engage in if this is something that you do want to be interested in. So I think in the survey, we're going to collect emails for people who are interested. As I said, we're trying to do a stop the bleed and a Narcan training before the end of the year, and kind of get this under your belts and start building your toolbox up so you can be more useful. And I think at this point too, we can take some questions from the chat if we have any.
Yeah, we've actually had a few questions. So somebody from social work was curious about how we're trained to manage the impact of what we've seen, and then also if we're trained in de-escalation. And I can kind of touch on some of this, and then if you guys want to jump in, that would be great. But I know that I did not receive a lot of training to handle what I've witnessed, what I've seen during my time as an EMT and just like in general. And so definitely, I think knowing that there is support available, I forgot to say it, but UNE offers counseling services for free if there's any students listening who may need those services. And I think they're a great resource for processing different things. I think the longer I've spent in EMS, the more I've seen this come to the forefront of how do we talk about as a squad, as a unit, how we process these things. But there's still a long way to go for these individuals. How about you guys? I'm also.
Yeah, I think the curriculum for my paramedic training and my EMT training did not have sufficient escalation stuff. That's their de-escalation. That's kind of the stuff that you can pick up on the street as you're engaging in these things. So it's unfortunate, but like I wish our classes and our curriculum had more of that, because my time as a paramedic, that was one of the areas where you just have to pick it up as you go. As far as like, I know in EMS, there's like critical incident stress debriefing is what they call it. And that's like a formalized way to decompress and debrief after a situation. But because of a protest, there's not going to be these established systems. So I think that is something that you want to be cognizant of, is like, know, in addition to like physical safety for yourself, know that your mental safety. Only engage in something like this if you are willing and able. And if you have issues or you find yourself compromised, then do try to seek that help.
Wyatt, Chris, John, do you have anything to add? How was your training maybe different in the military for how to deal with this stuff?
Yeah, in recent years, we've seen a lot more training for this prior to events, and how to go into these events knowing you're going to experience potentially traumatic events. And that's something to consider going into protests, and especially going into be a medical provider at a protest in protest medicine, is preparing yourself, learning what to expect and how your body and your like mind may react to what you experience. And so that's just one more step that you can take to prepare yourself, is do a little bit of research and see what is out there as far as support prior to being experienced, because that's going to put you in the best spot to handle and cope with anything that you do experience.
And then we also got a question from Alyssa about, can you explain more about why the LRADs would be against First Amendment rights?
Yeah, and it goes to a lot of counter protests that denying people their freedom of speech, which is what protests are. Specifically with LRADs, it is a sound device, and freedom of speech, while it does encompass all forms of speech, writing, and whatnot, physically having your voice restricted by a sound weapon is something that has been brought to several different courts in states where it has been employed as a like physical restriction of someone's First Amendment, even if it's not used as and like causing a permanent harm or anything. It is still restricting the people's ability to express that First Amendment, and it's a very like specific that it is sound, and you're preventing people from speaking their voices on the matter.
I think there's also a larger issue of peaceable assembly as a whole that's within the First Amendment.
Yeah, and that falls under all of the RCAs that we see. Is anytime there's a protest, there's the First Amendment considerations, just specifically with LRADs, where it's that sound that they're using against people that are using their voices.
I don't have any other questions in the chat, but if you do have other questions, feel free to ask them below.
I can also speak a little bit more about like back to that first question about being about debriefing or things like that. I think one of the challenges I faced this summer was actually like finding the right people to engage with at the protest. And because it was like COVID, so you can't just like go out and like look for people. Everyone's like very cautious of that. So I used my old paramedic contacts and I got in touch with local aid groups, and basically we were organizing on Discord and Signal because there was drones over Minneapolis and they suspected they might be using like one of the decrypting things to grab people's data. So there's like a lot of concern over that. So I think a lot of organization for these events, like when I got finally plugged into a group, you get a sense of solidarity with that. So like there was a specific group too I was trying to engage with, like with North Star Collective. They're one of the established Minneapolis street medic groups. So I called them, tried to get involved with them, but because I have family in law enforcement, they were really hesitant to let me in there, which is one of their boundaries, which I respected. I understood where they're coming from, because like they're operating in these environments and they don't want to risk, compromising the situation. So there's just such a myriad of factors involved in that, that the whole like finding out the best way to get involved is one of the challenges, and having some sort of like connection with the city does help a lot. Or if you can get plugged in beforehand with whatever groups are in your area, is going to be very, very helpful.
And I know this might be counter to what people are experiencing in terms of affinity for police, but where I was working in New York, we never responded to an emergency medical event without a police presence, and they were there to help protect us, to help with scene safety, and having that working relationship with them has really facilitated like my ability to participate, because then, you know, they're looking out for you when you're there and those who are around you.
Right. Yeah. And that's like kind of I think that's a good point too, because that highlights the difference between working in the capacity of a first responder versus volunteering as a street medic. Because as a street medic, you're not going to, like, the police aren't going to differentiate anyone in the protest as like a medic or not. And I had information on it, but there was like, even in North Carolina, aid stations, like medic aid stations that were destroyed. So I think it's one of those, it's like a sticky situation, especially given this is like, yeah, if you're like working EMS, like I've gone into scenes too, like during my paramedic work, where we would wait for a police escort to go in there because the scene was volatile. And you just don't have that luxury as a street medic, is you kind of just have to rely on yourself and the people that you're with.
We have another question. And yeah, Emily, if you want to speak to that, but we can potentially work on that. For anyone involved in protest performing medic duties, have you ever had any interactions with police yourself, and how did you handle that? Zach, explain, were you there to just provide aid? I think we just covered that, but if there's anything anybody wants to add.
I like during my time at the protest, I didn't have the interaction I had was like the same. Like I was embedded in the protest when I was actually like marching, and so like the police where like their presence was there, like they were all right, geared up, and they don't like really interact or talk with you as much. It's like definitely like a stonewall thing that they do. So I didn't have like any direct like back and forth with them. It's definitely the environment is like very, very different when you're in that situation, because like they just see like the protest as like everyone there is adversaries. So it's like they're not going to differentiate, because I like when I was there, I was like, I had marked myself as a medic. I did my best to identify that, but like it's still, when it comes down to it, they're not going to say like, oh, that person's like got a cross on their helmet, like let's not shoot tear gas at them. It's going to be kind of like a blanket thing.
I think Emily is able to speak now. We have just only a minute or two left, Emily.
Oh, I mean, I can answer any like questions about anything like that. It was just around there. One of the biggest things, there's like a thing called Feed the Movement, and a lot of the food sources that was going on there, that was targeted. There's also a jail support. There's a jail support going on, which was supporting protesters that did get arrested, and that was like actively sought out and destroyed. So at least in Charlotte, they were actively seeking this out to arrest them, destroy them, any station they had. You were not protected if you said you were a medic or trying to provide medical aid by any, you might even be targeted. So
no, thank you for sharing that.
This has been a terrific presentation. Thank you, Casey and Chris and Wyatt and Bethany and John. Really, really fantastic amount of information, really well organized, and such interesting stories. I'm sure you have many more stories that you could share if we had time for that. But thank you all for your time. And if you're interested in learning more about this, this group is going to work on Narcan training and possibly a Stop the Bleed training. So fill out your attendance sheet and we'll get back in touch with you a little bit later. There are more exciting events in our future as we move through the semester, and I hope that you will join us for the Leadership Conference on March 6th, for Improving Communication with Providers and Persons with Disabilities on March 17th. And all the way through to our poster session on May 5th. This event, as all of these events do, count toward your honors distinction application. So if you're planning to apply for an honors distinction, congratulations, you're 1/4 of the way through by having attended this event, and you can write a reflection on it. And we really look forward to seeing you at our next events and connecting with you again at the Narcan and Stop the Bleed trainings. Thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic night.